Hello and welcome. My name is Artur Rahimov, and in this video I'm going to talk about some political topics: Lenin, Stalin, Putin, roots of the war in Ukraine, communism versus capitalism, and West against East. So war in Ukraine, I believe, is not an accidental event, and Russia had millions of ties with all other countries, and of course with Western countries as well. As cancer cannot be blamed for any body organ, be it, for example, colon cancer or stomach cancer. So the war in Ukraine, I believe that the war is a reflection of the whole past history, the current state of interactions between East and West, and even the vision of Russia, its politics, its leaders, and the vision of capitalism as well. Of communism as well. Probably the vision of capitalism from Russia would be hard to tell, because these days Russia is not a communist country anymore. Now, before I begin this video, I want to tell a little bit about my past, because I have kind of some ties with communism, which took place when I was in high school, and maybe a little bit also later during my university years. Why? Because I grew up in Soviet times, and when I was in high school, during 2 years of last years of high school, like 2 last grades of high school, I was it's called Секретарь комсомольской организации in Russian. That means kind of chairman of student union. And our school was very large, more than 1,200 students, you can imagine. And all later year students, last 4 years, last 4 grades of the school, they were kind of required to be members of the Komsomol. And Komsomol was the communist youth organization. So I would say in our school probably more than 99% of students, or about 99% of students, were members of this organization, and I was a chairman, like a kind of chairman of student union of this organization. And therefore, of course, kind of I was well aware. I read Lenin. We had in our even in our home 3 very thick books called like selected works of Vladimir Lenin. Like each tom was really huge, probably about 1,000 pages, and I knew them, like I read them, I don't know, maybe a couple of times. And of course I was also educated kind of in these times, and because of that probably, and also like to start the dialogue, understanding of Russia. I haven't been in Russia since I left Moscow in 1994, and I'm a Canadian citizen already for more than 25 years. I'm going to start with the Lenin's or USSR or Communist Russia positive side. So, and probably so that we can kind of have a more full picture what was going on in Soviet Russia, and what is the situation now, and how the West perceived Russia, because I believe there is actually some serious flaws in the way how Western media, particularly newspapers, TVs, and other like mass media, portrays Russia. There are like certain expressions used, sometimes even by high-ranking politicians, like about saying it's like Tyrann country and so on. So it's probably a bit more complex than it is usually portrayed. So as a first kind of feature of Lenin's or Russia or USSR communism positive side, I'm going to tell about the fact which relates to care about females and women in general, and how this actually, I believe, changed the world. So in order to kind of to discuss this topic, I want to ask the following question. What was the first country in the world where women could vote? I looked a little bit online researching this topic, and the formal answer is following, that actually in 1893, so you can imagine like it's end of the 19th century already, in New Zealand we had laws where a number of territories allowed women to vote, but what happens at the same time, not all territories were participating in this in this practice, allowing women to vote. And we can also kind of understand that due to geographical position, New Zealand is kind of very remote country, as well as it's a very small country. The effect were very kind of the effect were local and we can say remote. So there were no kind of consequences, no viral effects. Now, okay, what would be now the next country maybe that created kind of the movement, the impetus, so that women were provided with the right to vote? Actually, in Russia, in March 1917, and that was before Soviet communists or Bolsheviks and Lenin came to power, because they came to power during the October Revolution of 1917. So at the same year, and that was already the time after the first Russian Revolution that took place in February 1917, the provisional government voted that women actually were provided with the rights. And although Bolsheviks disbanded this kind of government during October 1917 revolution, the movement was a powerful social and political force during the Tsarist era. And so that we can say that Russia was, and of course Bolsheviks actually totally accepted this idea. I'm going to tell a little bit about that later as well, certain other historical facts. But we can say certainly that this movement and this right to vote, like kind of law given by law, made Russia the second nation in the world that granted women the right to vote. Now, if we look at other countries, so we can think about USA, United States of America, and it was probably kind of 1917 or 1920s, depending on how we kind of present these events which took place at this time. So, for example, in 1917, in April 1917, there is a woman who was sworn to be as a member of the House of Representatives, but women still could not vote. Actually, what happens later in 1919, the Congress ratified 19th Amendment, granted women the right to vote. So you can say, like, okay, 1919, like about 2 years later, United States became the country where women could vote. Now, if we look at another country which kind of also influential in terms of its practices, politics and laws, kind of spreading to other parts of the world, we certainly should consider the United Kingdom, because English common law became like kind of foundation for United States laws and across Europe as well. So in UK actually it was only 1928 where women in England, Wales and Scotland received the right to vote on the same terms as men, and they should be like ages over 21, and it was a result of the Representation of the People Act of 1928. So we can have like here summary that, okay, Russia was 1917, United States 1919, and UK 1928. So that was kind of historical facts. But again, like talking about going back, like, okay, what was the first country? I mentioned New Zealand, but we can see here actually New Zealand changes took place even in 19th century, so kind of around 20 years before these events. But as soon as Russia provided women with the right to vote, and Bolsheviks, again, even though we had revolution, we still kept this right, we can say that actually there was kind of probably, most likely, there was an effect of Russia to grant women the right to vote, which created this movement in other countries. We can also consider another similar topic, which I was like kind of was curious about, because I remember this fact from some years ago. We can ask the following question: who was the first woman to become a cabinet minister? In the United States, we call it like a secretary of whatever, labor, defense, transportation, and other ministries. In other countries, in Russia, they would be called commissars probably after the revolution, And generally in the Western world, in most countries, it would be called, like, again, a cabinet minister, so the member of the government who represent, like, certain area. So going back to this question, okay, who was the first woman to become a cabinet minister? According to my research in history, again, doing like little bit of work, and again, I've heard this fact before, there's a woman called Alexandra Mikhailovna Kollontai, and she was like a revolutionary. And in 1917, again, virtually shortly after the October Revolution, she became the People's Commissar for Welfare, in Lenin's government, and she served there in 1917 and 18, and she was like a highly prominent woman, and within the Bolshevik party. So you can imagine, like, for many years before, women were like kind of course, had respect, we know it. And she was also the first woman to become the first woman ambassador. So that's we can again compare it with for example, other countries. And in the UK, there was a woman, Margaret Bonfield, who in 1929 became the first cabinet minister in the UK. So she was Minister of Labour in the Labour government. Now, in the United States, in 1922, she was the first female in the history to be appointed to the Senate. So that's again, that was 1922, and in 1933 only. So you can imagine, like, many years. In the United States, the first woman becomes the U.S. Secretary of Labor, and her name was Frances Perkins. So that's again historical facts. We can see here that again Russia was actually ahead of other countries of the world. And again, looking at these events, we can say that it looks like the Russia most likely produced a really serious impact in this area. So we can also ask maybe another question: why women never make it to the very top in Russia or the USSR? Because we have later, like, Stalin was the leader, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Yeltsin, Gorbachev, Yeltsin is the opposite order, and so on. I believe it certainly relates to the type of leadership which was created by Lenin, and I'm going to discuss this topic later, because the kind of two different movements, like enthusiasm among people, majority of people, not all people of course, were enthusiastic about communism. And at the same time, there are certain other effects and tendencies which was going on at the very top. And this I'm going to discuss also kind of on the level of personal psychology and organizational psychology. Okay, going back to changes related to position of the women in the modern world, we can say that actually Russia looks like changed the world for sure in this area, creating an example and making other countries to adopt the same view of women in their places. And it is hard to tell how many years it would take for other countries to have the same policy, to allow women to have the same right as men in relation to voting, like to be in politics and to become like leaders of the, let's say, cities, of governments and other kind of organizations. So note that actually when people discuss communism, we usually start that, okay, it's about care about working class, about very poor people, or proletariat, so-called working class, or even like the poorest people among the proletariat. And I believe that's kind of divides people, because in this situation we can, communists kind of, they had a belief, and that was foundation also of Karl Marx and Lenin, that communism is about care about proletariat, whereas capitalism, it's about like greed and making money by rich people. So, and therefore, when people start with dialogue, and again on the West, or like, let's say, teachers of history, for example, or politicians, when we try to explain what is communism or what is USSR is about, this focus on proletariat or on working class actually divides them to two different camps. And I believe that actually we should consider what was the positive effects, and this is why I started to talk about how Russia changed the world in relation to women having the same rights to vote and to be elected as men. So, and this is like practically took place in Russia. Now we can say that actually again that Russia probably created, probably I believe, in my view, it's certainly created a viral effect to the Western world and later for the rest of the world. Now we can ask here the following question: okay, does the West and others celebrate this contribution that Russia made to the world? Let's say, do we celebrate it together with modern Russian leaders to make this like a really historical change so that women were allowed to vote and to be elected? Another question could be here, I did not study this topic at all, do Ukrainian officials, let's say before this world, celebrated this change so that Russia produced this impact on the world? Now, let me continue with other good sides of Lenin before we go to some horrible things that he did. Now, Lenin was for free education for all and free higher education for all people, and that was actually policies. It was already during Tsar time, we have actually some very positive changes, like the country introduced kind of mandatory primary education so that all people, all children would go to school, and seems to be like, according to statistics, probably 90–95% just before the revolution already were going to school, reading, learning how to read, learning how to write, and doing simple math. And at the same time, later, like what happens that Russia had very hard time during the civil war, and in 24 the civil war ended. It was like also extreme famine during last years of the civil war, and some years later about 5 million people have died because of famine. And it was of course very hard to like focus, like to help to even like homeless children, to care about education, and some people were just trying to survive. But again, like as soon as they achieve like kind of a little bit, kind of at least stability and ability to feed to minimum level the country, so Russia provided not only free education, but the paid stipend for higher education, and in universities as well, so that like when I studied in Moscow University, I think all my classmates had stipend, called stipend, so kind of tuition or scholarship for students. And not only that, those students who were really successful according to their grades were given high stipend. And for example, my stipend was like nearly twice larger than the normal stipend, and that also like kind of allowed to buy maybe certain things, food and so on, so that to have kind of more kind of free life, maybe we can say in a way. So therefore, we can, if we compare Russia with other countries, to have like kind of virtually all over the country for all type of institution, like polytechnical institution, technical colleges and so on, to have this policy when after graduation from the high school, students would go and they get scholarship, and they would be provided with free housing, because this is also what I got, for example, when I was a student in the Moscow University. It was like really kind of unusual steps, because on the West, maybe these days there are some countries actually who having virtually not the same, they have free education at least, and so but having like this type of policy, it's kind of very really unusual contribution. There could be some countries where similar politics exist, but again Russia was pioneering in this area in terms of having it as a normal system for higher educational institutions. So what were results, like what was the practical results? Of course it allowed thousands of people to be who were, like, let's say, having very, very poor parents to become world's leading inventors, scientists, composers, artists, like to progress in many, many areas of life, because otherwise this path just probably would be closed if you cannot go to study during young years when you have good memory and when you can learn well. You would be just stuck for the rest of your life with things that you learn without being able to have this education. So, as I mentioned again, hundreds of students became very, very successful, world-leading experts, world-leading again professionals in all type of areas, scientists, inventors, composers, and so on. And for millions of people, it allowed them to have, again, like just to learn certain skills and to become, let's say, leaders in the particular fields, maybe in the small organizations, groups, and so on and so forth. So we can say that in this respect, Russia also would be very different, let's say, from United States, the United Kingdom, and other countries during the 20th century. So that would be another kind of positive side of communism, which we should definitely take into account, because it allowed very poor people to have this type of kind of education, so that they can again succeed in their lives. Next would be care about homeless. So in Russia, kind of what happens by the 1930s, again after these hardships caused by the civil war, Russia declared the abolition of homelessness, and it was done kind of in a bit maybe formalistic way and maybe in a bit forceful way, because Russia created a system where citizens should have a stamp in their passport, which called propiska. Propiska, kind of, it's a name. If I translate it, it's like you're kind of signed, you're kind of attached to a certain location, and so that on this stamp there would be address written, and that means this is the place where you're supposed to live. And so at the same time, what happens here is that, again, on the one hand, it was maybe a forceful kind of way, because it does not exist, let's say, on the West, so that people in the national passports would have the stamp related. Well, driver's licenses have stamp, of course, in the Western world. But here, what also happens that not only people were kind of required to have stamps, you could not be evicted or kind of, moved from this place unless there is a place somebody else where you would get the same kind of admission, so that you can move only, you can leave a place only if there is another place. So therefore you have kind of some kind of protection. So you have to have a conferred permission called order to register in another place. So that was kind of why I kind of believe that this topic is important. Well, I've been traveling for many, many years around the world, let's say United States and Europe in particular, for many, many years already, starting probably like from 10 years ago, and even this year. I was in, let's say, New York, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, many Atlanta, many other cities. I see hundreds, many large cities like New York, San Francisco, Philadelphia, would be thousands of homeless people. During last actually several already years, 3 or 4 years, I looked actually statistic due to COVID and some economic regression, economic crisis during last 4 years already. There's actually again rising percentage of homeless people in the United States, for example. So in Russia, I just haven't seen after all these years until 1994, spent again like how many years, 14 years I lived in Moscow, haven't seen homeless people there. Now last year I visited my aunt who lives in Minsk, Belarus, and we know that Belarus is like the closest ally of Russia, so actually Russian troops go to Ukraine to fight, and they use Belarus as a kind of basically as we learned to organize military operations, to move the troops, for example. And but spending about a month in Belarus, and I traveled intensively in Minsk, often like 1-2 hours or more every day, different parts, city center and other parts. I haven't seen any homeless at all, zero homeless at all, and streets are clean, subways very clean, like buses, modern kind of modern life. Yeah, I was really impressed by how this country functions. And my understanding is that actually Russia is way wealthier country than Belarus, and the situation is certainly not worse in large cities of Russia and other places of Russia than, for example, in Belarus. So going back to, okay, now we can look at the Western world, what is going on there. Well, thousands of people homeless, but question is, okay, how do we become homeless? There would be probably many paths to become homeless, maybe abuse of alcohol, street drugs, gambling, and so forth. But what happens here, kind of, it looks like the system maybe in a way does not care if we like apply a Russian or Soviet or communist standard, because in the Soviet Union, when I grew up, again, like kind of system were really kind of strict in terms of in relation to all these negative effects, let's say, of alcohol or street drugs, gambling and so on, by having rules where the community, local people, local policemen, local other people, local authorities would be helping, contributing, and neighbors as well, even ordinary neighbors, would help people to recover from, let's say, from these addictions. And so that we would not become homeless, we would be able to go to their work, earn money, and like have a kind of normal, ordinary life. So therefore, that's why Russia and USSR in the past had state laws to restrict this path, to prevent homelessness in like in the seats, like as soon as kind of there is a chance that it's actually the problem can grow worse, so the state would interfere, not maybe like directly, like again, like kind of top officials of the state, but there is like would be local people who would be taking care about this particular area. Now, next positive side of Russia would be, again, that I put last one here, care about working class, proletariat, poorest people, let's say, in relation to, again, healthcare, education, and their careers. And we can say that surely, yes, using oppression and liquidation of the rich people, royal family as well, during 1918, which we'll discuss a bit later, Russia not only kind of formally kind of as a claim of Bolsheviks and as well as other similar kind of revolutionaries, but it was practical actions of the government, of Lenin's government, to provide opportunities in life for working people. And I already discussed like how it helped in relation to education, free healthcare. I kind of did not even mention it, but it's of course also very different part which Russia had in the past, USSR had in the past. Russia now, it's, I think, way more complex because it has private medical clinics, for example. So that's they probably do not have like healthcare which covers absolutely everything. Now, so I'm going now kind of to have what would be Russia's external effects on the rest of the world. I already mentioned the liberation of women, or how women were granted rights to vote and be selected, be elected in different organizations, institutions, to be leaders of different, again, political organizations, government organizations, and so on. So there would be many effects, I believe, which a Russian Revolution and appearance of communism created in Europe particularly, and in the Western world, including especially North America, United States and Canada. One of them, I believe, would be peaceful disappearance of leading roles of monarchies in Europe. And it's historical fact actually that if we look when monarchies disappear, historians would mention there would be a kind of two waves of disappearance of monarchies and maybe like emergence of capitalism and like a kind of democratic republics in many countries across Europe, North America, and also the rest of the world with time later, let's say Latin America, Asia, Africa, and so on. So what happens here was one such wave took place after, we call it after World War I, and another one after World War II. But I believe it was actually not World War I, but the example of Russia that was actually the stronger factor of peaceful disappearance of leading roles of monarchies in Europe. Why? Well, because Bolsheviks kind of were not just extremely harsh, it was certainly a criminal act of Lenin and his team to murder royal family, and we again going to discuss this event later because it's also another side of Russia. But seeing this kind of harsh punishment of royalties, and of course it was also understandable that a lot of people, a lot of poor people and other people were unhappy with monarchy, and actually the Tsar we called weak, and the Tsar was incompetent, and many kind of people from with education, so-called intelligentsia, were criticizing the royal family for the really poor kind of skills to change, poor desire to change. And so that, I believe, was kind of the wave which took place after World War I, was not really caused by World War I, as many historians say, like why disappearance of monarchies, like kind of emergence of democratic republics took place in many countries of Europe, for example. I believe it was actually this example of Russia and this fear that actually if you try to hold power, it could be very harsh consequences, made this transition in Europe way more peaceful. And you can see here it was actually a really positive effect of Russia, because seeing this kind of barbarian way how we again murdered the whole royal family and many relatives of Romanov's dynasty, that actually made many royalties to, and the royalties, of course, we had often even blood ties, like with across countries, just to have to maintain friendship. That was common during medieval times, and Romanov's family and Russian monarchy had many of ties with I think Austria, Germany, France, other countries for many years before that, before the revolution. So therefore we can actually understand here that the effects which took place in Russia in relation to monarchy had actually kind of maybe in a way an expected positive effect on peaceful developments in Europe in relation to again creating of democratic republics. So not only that, I believe that also effect of Russia made the particularly Europe, more kind of capitalistic country, North America, to really care about the working class, because we can see how much rough power, rough kind of raw power is hidden in this mass movement, which can become extremely violent and extremely aggressive. So it was not a formal law in those countries, like again talking about Europe and North America, to care about the working class, but this is what certainly the capitalists, the richest people, learn from the Russian example, so that you actually have to reward those working people who work hard, who are extremely useful for your company, corporation, or like some other whatever like private organization we had. And therefore I believe that was kind of not a formal law, but rather a lesson from the neighbor that allowed these countries to have this kind of more respectful, more peaceful development, so that actually rich people would care about poor people way better, just due to this violent example from Russia. Now, so we can kind of talking here about maybe a spiritual part of effects of Russia, so a peaceful transition from monarchies to capitalism, and care about working class, liberation of women, and we also influx in the labor world. That was another big factor, because again, liberation of women, plus of course it was also effect of a earlier way of contraception in 1920s, plus of course it was a very different situation in relation to kind of having children. Contraception was a big factor, but sexual activity was not so normal, common in 1920s, because probably up to 1960s, not probably, it is up to 1960s generally in the Western world, most women, they did not have other sexual partners when they married. So, and they were kind of practicing sexual monogamy, as for example anthropologists or other scientists would say. So therefore women were actually huge kind of additional force which entered the labor market, both during 1920s in Russia and in the Western world. And therefore, I believe, like kind of in another idea which may look probably strange for many Western people, because I believe that there was a big impact, maybe decisive impact that Russia caused on economical boom that took place in 1920s. And I'm talking about so-called Roaring Twenties. Roaring Twenties, like, well, people who know history of the Western world, they would be certainly aware. It's a period of rapid economic growth and social change. Well, and now Roaring Twenties, sometimes referred as the decade also of big developments in music, fashion, and it happens again across the Western society and Western culture. So that's kind of how it is defined. And I believe that actually again Russia was a big factor, very possible that it was a single decisive factor that allowed again to taking into account this factor and kind of appearance of women, because women also, see, when women were basically slaves during human evolution, and we are kind of sexual, physical slaves in the chimp culture from which we started to evolve, so during like last 5 million years. And when we are granted like these rights, actually we use it like with, I believe, kind of with wisdom, because you know they would not be kind of something which would make them, okay, we were like slaves, now let us be like kind of become maybe more aggressive, and now kind of suppress males, suppress men, so that we now start to rule the world. It was not this way, of course, because women accepted, I believe, this right to vote with grace, and that was a huge, again, contribution, and this peaceful transition from monarchies to republics in many countries around the world. So all these factors together, I believe, made Roaring Twenties possible. So now I believe that can be called as external positive effect of communist Russia and the events which took place after 1917 revolution in Russia on the rest of the world. So Roaring Twenties. So you have like how many, 5 qualities I mentioned of positive side. Now we can go to the second part, and here I'm going to discuss Lenin's or communist kind of negative side. And actually this negative side, maybe I can give you maybe short introduction how I became aware myself, because I was very young. I was probably 14 or 15 years old in high school, so it was like grade 8 or 9, when my history teacher told to the whole class that Lenin sent a secret telegram to Sverdlovsk Soviets committee, so committee of Bolsheviks, like the power in Sverdlovsk, and Sverdlovsk is the largest city really close from the area where I grew up, because I grew up in Chelyabinsk region, it's South Europe, and Sverdlovsk is kind of middle Europe. And the order was to shoot all members of the family. So that was how he presented the news to us. The news kind of sunk to my memory, and I thought, like, oh, that's kind of, yeah, this is how we dealt with capitalists, how people, and kind of hard to say, but I did not give probably any second thoughts to this idea. My teacher probably knew it very well, since he was a member of the Communist Party. Not only that, he was probably the most respected teacher in our city, and he was a honorable teacher of Soviet Union, and he was even a participant of one of the Congress of Communist Party in Moscow. So there were like, I don't know, maybe a few thousand people who attended those congresses every 5 years back during Soviet times, and so he was participating in this like a whole Soviet Union event, and so like, yeah, being a communist, being like probably most respected teacher in our city, I believe he knew well, and it looks like, again, most historians believe that that was true. So now, if we look at kind of evaluation of this event right now, in 2008, so relatively recently, like about 15 years ago, the Supreme Court of Russia, of Russian Federation, ruled out that the Nicholas II and his family were victims of political repression and rehabilitated them. So that means they were not guilty of anything. And while again Lenin ordered to kill them. Now, not only that, so again, like, so Nicholas II, his wife, and 5 children, and they were aging, I think, from age 5, 6. Alexis was the youngest one, and 4 sisters he had. So they were, the oldest one was a teenager, late teens. So all these people were murdered by Bolsheviks. Plus to that, of course, it was already a horrible event, like why Bolsheviks would murder children. Lenin, of course, he had his own reasons for that. We'll discuss it later. But what we can also mention here, like kind of another part of Russia, when this type of things start, there's another kind of very hard question which Stalin could not answer really well. Where are you going to draw the line? Where you're going to stop? And here we can provide the following facts: not only the royal family, but 4 members of the royal court, and they had physician, we have a cook, we had a footman, and the lady in waiting, we were also murdered together with the royal family, probably to kind of eliminate witnesses of this crime, which I'll discuss a bit later. Now, not only that, on the next day of this, after this murder, 6 more members of the Romanovs family, including Grand Duchess Elizabeth, they were murdered as well. So we can see here, like just during this couple of days, 17 people were murdered, and of those 13 were members of the Romanovs family. Now, during later years, what happened with Nicholas II had a brother. He was murdered some month later, and Bolsheviks, when these murders took place, I believe there was also some secret orders from Moscow, from Lenin. They also did like many kind of gruesome things. Let's say they would often tie grenades to the body and made this grenade to explode, so that to mutilate the faces, to mutilate the body parts, so that later it would be impossible to recognize these people. So, of course, very gruesome part. Apart from that, what happens that Bolsheviks organized kind of propaganda, false propaganda, that some members of royal family, let's say again like Nicola's second brother, and some other members, dukes, duchesses, were killed by extremists. So, and it looked like Bolsheviks were even trying to protect them. This is how Lenin presented, wanted to present himself to both to the world and to the to Russian people, to citizens of the country. So here again, like, okay, what was Lenin's negative side? We can say that he was basically a criminal according to laws of any country. He was a criminal and the group leader or organizer of murders of thousands of people. And later he was like millions of people by Stalin. So we discussed, because there was like, of course, a connection how Stalin came to power and why Stalin continued to murder with even more vigor. And here we can kind of go into next into kind of personal psychology of Vladimir Lenin, or like his original surname was Ulyanov, Vladimir Ulyanov. And so what happens during his childhood, so we are now going to consider why Lenin was maybe so harsh in his, again, position, in his treatment of all the royal families, including children. So in order to understand that, we have to go back actually about, how many, about 30 years back, more than 30 years back. So what happens when Lenin was young, in 1887, so Lenin was 17 years old, so you can imagine like a teenager boy. And so Lenin had a brother who was 3 years older, so the brother was 20 years old. And so we were both members, not members, but kind of by way of use, were people who did not like the monarchy. And his brother was a revolutionary, he was a spiritual leader and ideologist of the group that conspired to assassinate Alexander III of Russia. So Vladimir Lenin was 17 at the time, and the attempt to assassinate the emperor, the Tsar, Alexander III, was unsuccessful. So they planted a bomb under his carriage, but the bomb did not explode. And I think more than 10 people were caught, like kind of as participants of this event. And Alexander III pardoned many of the people, many of the members of his group, but 5 of them were hanged. And that was also his brother, and so and 4 of his friends were hanged. And of course, for Lenin, it was a huge stress. You can imagine he lost his brother. The attempt to assassinate the Tsar was unsuccessful. And history books, like again when I was children, I think probably all history books across the Soviet Union had this historical phrase that Lenin told to his parents, that we are going to use a different way, like if I translate it from Russia, or we shall choose a different path, something like this. For many years I was thinking like, in a way like not the path of terrorism, of trying to kill one person, but rather than like gather masses and kind of to accomplish the goal. And what was the goal? There was another question, because again Lenin could be unhappy, sorry, about the monarchy, but again, like where he's going to draw the line, that was the question. So what was the effect of this event when the member of the family, Ulyanov's family, were hanged. Of course, the whole family was ostracized. We lost many friends, so it was huge kind of spiritual and emotional stress for Vladimir Lenin. And in the past, I thought, yeah, he would choose a way like, okay, not to become a terrorist. But now I view it actually a bit differently. So he looks like he decided not just to murder the Tsar, the emperor of Russia, but to murder all his family and all relatives as well. So that could be actually the part that the kind of the explanation of this phrase. Now we can also look maybe kind of at this event from maybe kind of personal psychology viewpoint, and maybe look even at this event from a view which maybe people could have many centuries later, or maybe many thousands years later. So imagine like people would discuss, and maybe some history teacher or some history professor would ask a class, do you remember who was Lenin? And the students would go around, who was Lenin, who was Lenin? Oh, then one like somebody would say, oh, Lenin was a man whose brother was hanged by the king for his unsuccessful attempt. So what Lenin did, 30 years later, he gathered like millions of poor people and murdered the whole royal family and murdered virtually all their relatives. So it was more like kind of a story from ancient Greek, maybe Greek mythology, where we have like this type of like fairy tales or kind of myths. So what happened? So that was like the story of Vladimir Lenin, who kind of had a revenge. So now we can keep this kind of again fact in mind, going now to the following detail. How did Lenin organize and present this murder? So that would be an important fact, because just days, or maybe even 1-2 days before this family, there was a Dutch, I think Dutch newspaper asking Lenin, okay, is the royal family alive? And Lenin wrote to them, wrote a note actually, that we were totally normal and we were protected by Bolsheviks. So, and in reality he was already like sent the telegram to kill them. So you see, Lenin was kind of was becoming like a master of his manipulative politics. And what we can see here, that he had some close circle of his friends for whom it was really important to create an impression and to protect the image of the Lenin, to create the impression that he was not responsible for murders, so he was not responsible for liquidation of the Romanov family, and it was actually organized by the local communists or Ural Soviets in Yekaterinburg, Cheka, the people who did this thing, again murdering Romanov's family. So we can see here that actually one feature of his leadership was avoidance of responsibility for killings, for many killings, killing again court members, like I mentioned, a physician, a cook, footman, lady in waiting, and framing others, kind of blaming others for this event, which just by itself, like in many countries, just according to the law, like when you say that somebody else murdered, it's like it's a punishable, it can be a criminal offense. So now we can have here, of course, a bunch of, if we look again from modern viewpoint, bunch of aggravating factors. But before going to these aggravating factors, again, kind of, if we look at the picture here, so what Lenin got from the Romanovs family was they killed, they hanged 5 people who had an unsuccessful attempt. And here we can kind of back up and look at this event from, like, let's say from legal viewpoint or from humanitarian viewpoint, asking the question, okay, was it like right or appropriate punishment to execute 5 people for unsuccessful attempt to kill, let's say, like even to kill, like let's say, a president or a king, monarch, and so on, a leader of the country, a leader of the state. Certainly, by modern standards, probably there would be not a single country in the world where such harsh punishment would be like a reality, like something which would take place in life. Whereas again, it was 1888, so it was the end of the 19th century, where this again event took place in Russia, and we can imagine, of course, there was a huge level of hostility between the Romanovs family and revolutionaries, because there are like various groups of people, and just I think several years before this unsuccessful attempt, there was a successful attempt where monarch was actually killed by a bomb. So now let us look now at later effects which took place after many years, because Lenin, as I already discussed, organized this murder machine, and plus of course like Stalin later came into the picture. Where to draw the line and who is a capitalist? So that's a very hard question, because again, like when Lenin was started to kill Romanov's family, like he went to, I think, like kind of second, up to second, and maybe up to even third degree relatives, killing tens of people of the Romanovs family. And some historians believe that it was not Lenin's only decision to kill, let's say, even Romanov's family, but like there is this opinion exists, because like hard these days, like seems to be there is no agreement among historians who exactly ordered the execution of the Romanovs family. But again, some historians believe that it was actually a trio of people. That means not only Lenin, but also Sverdlov and Dzerzhinsky. These were like two comrades of the Lenin, two highest ranking officials in the Bolsheviks party and in the government, government of Russia at this time. So it was a trio of people, and I believe here what happens that it is possible that later KGB, well, it was not KGB yet, of course, because KGB appeared way many years later, but ЧК, NKVD, GRU, like different names, like Secret Service of Russia had. It was a trio of people, a trio of local secret agents who were to decide the fate and sometimes execution, sometimes sending to Gulag labor camps. That was for more than 90% of people were the same as a death sentence. So we were to decide the destiny of these people. You know? And so we'll discuss it later, kind of how this effect relates to what was going on at the same time in the Western world, United States or United Kingdom. So we can see here that actually in 1917-1918, Lenin created kind of the hidden real Soviet government within the formal one. So the formal leaders, kind of even among Bolsheviks, within the Bolsheviks party, kind of comrades. But what happens here is that some of them were actually believing in these things, such as, for example, that the Bolsheviks were protecting Romanov's family, even though that they were already killed many months ago. It was like after many years, it was like acknowledged that actually it was Soviet Ural Committee of Soviets of Ekaterinburg ЧК who ordered to kill the Romanovs family. So now we can here mention the following historical example. There was a note written by Lenin: "Do not tell anything to Ioffe," and Ioffe was also high-ranking member of the Russian government, Lenin's government. Do not tell to Ioffe so that he can lie smoother. So that was actually the Lenin's order directive to those people who were within the government. So now therefore we can imagine that actually Lenin created a really kind of special government in the Soviet Union, where there were many members. Let's say again, I mentioned Sverdlovsky, Dzerzhinsky, Stalin, who was the editor of the Pravda, of the largest newspaper at this time, and these people were aware about these events. We knew all these details, but there were other people again in the government, in the Lenin government, who were like naive people who did not even know that actually Bolsheviks were killing Romanovs and killing like members of the family all over the country. Plus, of course, there are many other, of course, assassinations, many other killings as well. Let's say the generals and other people close to the monarchy and other people. So let's say we can see that Lenin actually created a government within the government where certain people, certain positions were occupied by, let's say, people whom he trusted completely, and certain other positions were occupied by people who were kind of not trusted, and they were not provided with the information related to murder, for example, of Romanov's family. So that, as again Lenin wrote in this note, that so that we can lie to public media, to journalists, to reporters smoother. So we can see that Lenin kind of was a master, maybe we can say, chimpanzee politics, because in chimpanzee clinic, like having like these kind of alliances, you know, within the group of, is very common practice. So Lenin was, in a way, we can also say that was a creator of new mentality or style of leadership, because by hiding these kind of gruesome or criminal, we can say, events from public view, again, even from members of his government, from members of his party, from very, very top, he kind of created the following idea, or he probably believed in the following idea that, look, I am so special, I am so smart and wise, and we people, we are so naive and so limited and also illiterate, so that for we good, and while creating, of course, confusion and misdirection of attention, trick, I will secretly kill those members of the Romanov family and children, pretending that somebody else did it. And this kind of event is even so hard to explain to you that even if I try with my best efforts to explain it to you, you would not get it. So that was kind of position which we can view on the one side, but probably we can also view it maybe from a totally different viewpoint, such as, for example, he actually believed that these were not right, not good things to do. They were not like, not proper, not something which would result in positive effects later, things to do, and that was the reason he was most likely, probably, again, like I believe in this idea these days more, he was actually afraid of people and afraid of telling the truth to people, so that he would, yeah, be having fear of being understood. So the question then, of course, becomes the following. So in all these like rules and changes that we did for the country, again in relation to women and working class, the question is, did he really care about people when he was afraid to tell them the truth about the royal family? Were they really also royalty, like Romanov's royalty, were really dangerous to this degree so that we like should be killed? Romanov's family, by the way, it's a bit kind of complex situation, because maybe there was kind of a slightly mitigating factor why Lenin decided to kill Romanov's family. Why? Because there was some advance from Siberia. There was some general who was a supporter of the monarchy. With his army he was advancing, and he was like soon to take, you know, parts of Urals of this, and that was the reason kind of we did not know should like probably they could evacuate the Romanov's family closer to Moscow, like closer to the west, away from this advancing army of people who were supporting monarchy. So, but at the same time, we know that, let's say, even during 1917 elections, monarchists, so-called, like the group of people, they had very, very little support already among the general population, even for the so-called capitalistic society which existed shortly between two revolutions in Russia, between February 1917 and October 1917 revolution, when there was a provisional government. The monarchies did not have much support, much power from people. So therefore, like, actually it was like no real need to kill children, to kill the whole family of again of Romanovs at this time. One may say that well, there's like many military generals were supporters of the Tsar, and that was like probably a big reason. But again, like, it was very little support among people. So now we can see here that this is actually a really complex personal psychology topic. If we start thinking about, okay, did he care really about people, or his revenge really ruled his motivation and actions? So, and this is kind of a question which maybe we can speculate about, because it does not require us to take any actions about, just it's like the question of, okay, just a question of like really more kind of intellectual, okay, what was the motivation of this person. So now going back to Lenin's decision to kind of orders to murder people, and later, let's say, how Stalin used kind of similar way, creating trios of commissars or trios of secret agents, which later like resulted in millions of deaths, like sending people to Gulag labor camps, and often like again like having these so-called pogroms and purges, as we call it, like Stalin's purges. We can say here there were following kind of components in their behavior. So one effect was there was no accusation or verdict given to people who were to be killed, for example. So we could be said that you are just the enemy of the people. So this is how Stalin used this phrase later. Next, these people did not have ability to defend themselves, and of course we did not have any lawyers or other people who would help them to defend themselves. Now, there was another, of course, element here. There was no neutral decision makers. So the government, Lenin's government, Lenin himself, later like these secret agents from all these GPU, GRU and KVD, they would blame, and there would be also the people who would have a verdict to present to the person, so to the people who were persecuted. That was the state, how Russia, kind of, how Lenin organized this kind of situation when there is a state against the person. So he was in the same situation long ago. So we can, as I discussed already, the Tsar and the royal monarchy had very harsh punishment in relation to his brother, and now Lenin kind of decided to pay back with this kind of similar, very harsh methods, techniques, and even while deceiving the own people, deceiving the members of the Communist Party, of the Bolsheviks Party, of the government. Now we can back up and look at these events from a different viewpoint, because the world was developing, like kind of in Russia, USSR, but also there was a Western world developing at the same time. So what was developments in this area? Like I mentioned, these factors related to like ability to defend yourself, neutral decision makers. In the West, we consider North America, the United Kingdom, what they had in the legal system, and that was already having like many centuries in many cases, they had a system which is called due process. Sometimes it's called fair process. when again there is like kind of situation when the state wants to restrict freedom or punish or imprison or maybe even execute some particular person. So what is a due process? Due process is viewed as a kind of legal requirement, so that the state must respect all legal rights and that are owed by the person. And so to have the balance between the state and the rights of the person. And if we look at, let's say, ask the questions about what are the different components of the due process of law, well, different sources can give you different kind of even number of components. It could be 3, 5, 7, sometimes even more. But generally it is can be related to, let's say, 3 different areas. So that the person must give a notice, he should have an opportunity to be heard, and the decision should be made by some neutral decision maker. So let's say that's one way how due process is presented in the Western world, and this is again where Western world was developing. Now some sources may say, oh, there are actually seven elements of the due process, and so the government must present beyond reasonable doubts, let's say in criminal cases, a clear and convincing evidence for all type of intrusion, interference with rights of people. So the person should get the right to counsel, so that he would get somebody to form his positions, to form his or her defense. Now, person has the right to have a pre-deprivation hearing, the right to cross-examine witnesses, so the right to have a neutral person review an adverse decision, so that somebody else would review this adverse decision, the right to recover compensation for a wrongful deprivation, so, and the right to be present and when adverse evidence is presented. So all these things like also constitutes or represent so-called due or fair process. And we can see that here in the Western world, United States, UK particularly, the world moved kind of in the very opposite direction, because even up to current days, you can easily find this information, we still argue what are exact elements of the due process and what is exactly, what is really fair process, how we can really provide the person with protection so that the state does not kind of start to persecute their own people. You know? Now, that was how the West was developing, but I believe kind of, if we look at really last 20 years or more, I believe that actually the situation is very different, because due or fair process now, even though it's a formal part of laws, constitutions and different like kind of rules created to protect human rights, rights of people, I believe that these days we have very different situation, particularly in the last probably nearly 3 decades, last 30 years. Why? Because of the appearance of Western secret services, and the use, this part is very important, of KGB practices, because what we did, we borrowed the same techniques which KGB used to control all communication, to decide themselves who is guilty of some offense, and we just punish people themselves as well. So that's a common practice, although it's not discussed at all in public media, although I had like kind of videos and I have some information on my other blog, stop007.net, where I discuss these effects, what type of activities are common for modern Western secret services to some degree, and how they practice it, how we do it practically. That's another huge problem, because very few people are aware that it's actually local secret agents in most majority of Western countries can easily decide what type of interference they can have with any individual, people who, let's say, a person who is totally innocent, who did not commit any crime and did not do anything wrong, At the same time, secret services can do all type of nasty things, such as, for example, destruction of health of person, or stealing his personal property, or destruction of his private property, which I, for example, in my own case, I had it even just, let's say, in Canada last week, for example, such cases. So, and while traveling around the world, I realized that actually secret services these days, it depends more on the location where you are, and often it's not only location, it's the time of the day. Let's say if it's a weekday or if it is weekend, it's a big difference. And later, thinking about this fact, I actually realized that there are just different teams, different shifts of secret agents work at this time, and that is why we can have a totally different treatment of the same person while even being in the same location. We can present a very large number of such events. So, but okay, going back to, it's a separate topic of course, but going back to Soviet times and communism and capitalism, later what happens with, let's say, after Lenin's death, Stalin, who was not as intelligent, and you remember I discussed the situation which Lenin created in the government, where there are certain positions occupied by trusted people and certain positions by people who were not trusted. Basically what Stalin did, he erased all people who were not trusted. So he left only those people who would be trustworthy, so the others were killed. So including those members of the party who were closest relatives, who were in the Communist Party even from the 19th century. So there are many of those, tens of those as well, like very, very old Bolsheviks, like experienced Bolsheviks, communists. So then therefore another negative part again of what Lenin created was he created the foundation for Stalin's purges, in which over 20 million of people died. So he created basically the machinery, the attitude, the perception, and in a way Stalin was probably even more honest people because he did not need to lie as much as Lenin about who killed those people, because Stalin was like done in a different way. Now back to Lenin again, and back to his new style of presenting his murders to own people. We can also think about the following question. Did we have in our history, in human history, any past, or maybe even later, tyrant or revolutionaries or some kind of very kind of aggressive leaders of countries, presidents and so on, who practiced the same thing as Lenin did? And I was thinking about like many people who existed in antiquity. So there are many people who were maybe in more recent times, like people would think, okay, after Lenin there was like Adolf Hitler, who started Second World War and killed millions of people around the world. But Hitler did not present that somebody else like was killing Jews and so on. He did not have this type of mentality of presenting own actions as if somebody else did it. So it was certainly became part of later again secret services of Russia and KGB policies. And I believe in, as I mentioned it a little bit already in this video, in 1990s the big change took place in the Western secret services due to immigration of thousands of Soviet people to the West. And when we immigrated, we certainly started to tell stories about all type of situations we had with KGB people. And we can imagine that there were thousands and thousands of simple government workers, let's say in the police office or in some telephone company or in some postal office or in some other organization where actually not the formal leader, like let's say not the manager or the director of some postal office or postal station or some police department or some again telephone location, telephone company, let's say, but it was actually a KGB agent who would give them orders, and they would be kind of not employees but people who were obliged to report any kind of deviations from something abnormal, and who would follow special orders when we wanted from these KGB officers. So I believe that exactly the same thing took place in the Western world, where we borrowed this method, because if you look at history of the West, people remember about Watergate scandal. It was 1960s, and it was like kind of FBI agents were like kind of trying to install eavesdropping devices somewhere. No, like if modern secret agents like told this story, like it's crazy thing going on, because for the modern secret agent, be it like whatever, Republicans, Democrats, or in other, like let's say in European countries, or in Canada, like Liberal Party, or any other place, the let's say secret agents these days would go to any building, any office, any organization, like where, let's say, like leaders located, present themselves. I'm here the boss now. I represent national security, as you would say, and so you are now supposed to do what I am telling to you. And this story from 1960s looks like total like crazy thing, like lunacy, like some absolute nonsense. You know, FBI agents were caught trying to install like some eavesdropping devices, you know, in some like offices of political parties, like like looks like total nonsense. Why? Because again, like these days it's totally different story. Like when the secret agent go to police department, he can line up all these police officers. I've seen it. I know how we can do it. Can make a phone call, and all building, like let's say central building of some police department, all of them would be lined up so that the secret agents could go and tell them something. It was not the police chief who is the real boss, because these days the situation in the West, it's like really different from what people believe in. So okay, now what was the next event which took place shortly after Lenin organized this murder of Romanov's family? Actually it took place very, very soon, about 1 month later, because it was Lenin's assassination. A funny Kaplan, a member of the Socialist Revolutionary Party, she shot 3 shots using a handgun, close distance. Lenin was, I think, just 2, 3, 4 meters away, very close, and so he wounded him badly, because there were shots into his neck, into his shoulder, and so he lost his consciousness, and he basically never recovered it until his death in 1924. So why did she do that? And she provided very simple explanation. Lenin was a traitor. So was he a traitor? Indeed, like why she was unhappy about Lenin? Why she called him the traitor? Well, the thing is that, you know, during provisional government, like if we look at statistics, the socialist revolutionaries, we had more than 40% of votes in the provisional government. So what we decided to do, we formed a government together with Bolsheviks, so that together we would have majority of votes, and that would allow them to form the government. And this is what we did for the provisional government. But in October 1917, since Bolsheviks were much more aggressive party with more guns, we managed to arrest all members of the Socialist Revolutionary Party, and that was actually a so-called October Revolution. So now I have like a little bit different views, because I learn all these historical facts which we don't tell much about. We kind of skip it away from Soviet history lessons. So we basically arrested we we formed a union, you know, like saying, oh, we are now friends, let us together form a government. This is what socialist revolutionists and communists, we did together to form a government. And later this smaller part, like communists, Bolsheviks, headed by Lenin, just arrested the rest of the government, and they say, oh, now we are going to rule the country. So this is, so you can see here, Lenin indeed was a traitor, because he kind of gained first trust, you know, kind of of socialist revolutionaries, and later he arrested them. So this woman, Fanny Kaplan, who tried to murder Lenin, she was right. Lenin was a traitor. So she had like all type of rights. Yeah. So Lenin is gone. Lenin was severely wounded, and she was of course not as healthy for remaining years of his life, and basically like he slowly died later from strokes. So the question is, okay, who is left to lead the country, to lead the government, when Lenin like kind of getting worse in his health and not able to rule actually anymore? Well, of course, the answer would be, those who have more guns, who have more aggression, was to rule, and that was Joseph Stalin. So Stalin's visions of the world and what he did in the world. So first of all, Stalin knew all these events. He knew about how his brother was hanged for what, of course, for an unsuccessful attempt to kill the royal family, the Tsar, and what he did. He saw how Lenin murdered, in maybe again most likely as his revenge, the Romanovs family and many relatives around, and now Stalin saw how Kaplan basically murdered Lenin. So he saw all this drama of murders in his life, and he saw like all this kind of extremely violent world in which he lived. So therefore, we can say like he got like a really clear impression like how the world should function. He did not grow up like on the ideas of helping, really caring about poor people, like having peaceful developments, having peaceful friends and so on. He was people like were kind of surrounded by violence, by aggression, by guns. Not only that, if we look at his years and for like decades before the revolution, he was kind of a robber. He was a criminal and money supplier for the party. So he was racketeering in Batumi, later I think in Tbilisi and Baku, different cities again in Georgia, Azerbaijan, and racketeering, like basically coming with guns and forcing businesses to pay some money to him for like kind of for defense, for the kind of, so that we would be for protection that he provided. This is like how racketeering probably was done at this time. And we can see here that Lenin actually was he attracted all types of people who were unhappy with the rich people, so including criminals. So he had indiscriminate movement. So I believe, therefore, we can say here that actually it was not care about people, but more kind of anger against the rich. And therefore he was also, we can say here that he was also a person who practiced more kind of exclusive policy, so to exclude rich people from the country which he visioned like that Russia should become. Now we can look again to back up and think, okay, if there is like some movement, some political party, we take away a leader, who is going to lead this part of movement, of country, of government, political movement, political party? And we can compare Lenin with, let's say, leaders of United States, presidents, maybe from United Kingdom, other countries. So what we have here, we have like kind of succession of people who are united, and when one taken away, killed, maybe died from some other causes, there would be many others who would continue to have maybe similar, most likely, nearly certain, very similar politics. There would be, of course, some differences which media would discuss a lot and so on, but on some level, like in relation to certain fundamental things, we would be continuing to do the same things which we see normal for the politics, like be it, let's say, United States one, or UK would be another, some other country in the Western world would be a different thing. So if we think therefore of virtually any past or present US president, and let's say he would disappear, who would be leading? Of course we have formal rules who would become a president and so on. But apart from that, we can see here that actually these people in the Western world would have really a mass movement of spiritual supporters, of people who would do the same, whereas in Russia's case it was actually the most aggressive person, Stalin, who became the leader of the country. And so therefore we can say here that actually Lenin created again in this also respect, on this particular area, the foundation. Not only he created the murder machine, as I mentioned, but he also created kind of spiritual foundation, organizational foundation for Stalin to become the leader. So therefore what happened later kind of again is completely logical from personal and organizational psychology viewpoint. So therefore we can kind of have these ideas together with other questions that I want to ask. What was the personal qualities of Lenin? Why I'm asking this question? Because when I grew up in Soviet Union in Soviet times, there were of course many accounts, stories, testimonials of different people, particularly of course poets, writers, historians and so on, who visited Lenin, and later they wrote like a story about what happened, like some kind of simple events, like how we interacted, what Lenin said, and so on. We can ask, okay, the following question, because I read I knew many of such stories. It was also part, of course, of our curriculum when I was a high school student. But they were, kind of common to know. We can ask the following question: was Lenin a happy man? Did he smile a lot, for example? So actually, I remember it was most common expression, probably in all, maybe in all cases. We can say that in this type of situation, what these people would write, like when we visited Lenin and had like personal, often one-to-one conversation, interactions with him, they would write that he could squint and smile slyly. Okay? This is like expressions most likely used by those people who knew him personally. And therefore, we can say here that actually he was certainly a very hard-working person. He was very motivated person, and he was extremely prolific writer, like by how much he wrote. At the same time, looking back at all these facts which took place during his life and all these activities which he organized, it seems like that he was more driven by revenge and anger rather than care about people. So that was kind of my view. And again, we can have here variety of mitigating factors. He was born in a family again where his brother was executed, so it was maybe a case of revenge. And also one factor probably would be true here, that for many decades he was the subject of persecutions and hostility. Of course, he initiated it himself because he was excluded from the university for political activities, for kind of revolutionary activities or terroristic activities, as it was formerly called. And therefore, he had a very hard time all these decades until basically until October Revolution, when he became the leader of the country, of the government and the country in 1917. And we can say probably here could be one mitigating factor, that he committed the offense under duress, under big stress. So, but it's kind of also tricky, because he was under this huge stress for 30 years, but when he already got the power, he was certainly relieved from many things. At the same time, again, he decided to murder not only Romanov's family but also children, and again many relatives of the Romanov's family. So, looking back again, then let us look at quickly at the summary what kind of I want to present in this video. So Lenin and USSR, communism, like Soviet communism, because it's not all communism, because communism, as like if we look at formal definition, was a kind of ideology created by Karl Marx, and the idea was, okay, we have to give we have to give all poor people the right to own the tools, the factories, and the things, so that we can rule the world, so that we don't belong to some capitalist, because otherwise we are going to be, poor people are going to be exploited. So Marx created this idea, this utopia, that there is like some world could exist where all people are happy. But he did not provide one very, very important answer. Okay, how we are able, how people would be able to achieve this goal? What are you going to do with capitalists, with rich people? So, and in Lenin's case, in Russia case, Soviet Union, we can see that it took extremely violent, extremely barbaric way, where all these rich people were murdered, executed, sent to Gulag labor camps already during 20s and during Stalin's times as well. But the positive sides, okay, let's again go back there. Okay, about females and women and how this changed the world, this is we discussed in detail. Now next one, free education, free higher education for all. Care about homeless people, so that people don't become homeless. Care about working class, especially the poorest, so that in healthcare, education, careers, we can have really big advancement. External positive effects, we discussed here about peaceful transition from monarchies to capitalism, to republics, to democracy in many countries. Why? Because of fear of working class, so therefore we cared about working class. Liberation of women and the influx into the labor market, and possibly, very possibly, again I believe in this idea, there's a huge impact, maybe the strongest single impact on the appearance or like on the economic growth and the so-called Roaring Twenties in the Western world. So that was positive side of Russia. Now, negative part. Lenin should be considered as a criminal and the group leader of and organizer of thousands of murders. So that's a fact here. He was not only the person who organized these murders as a leader, he also avoided responsibility for killing, and he also framed others, blaming that others, some extremists, were responsible for deaths of people, while kind of creating also an illusion that Bolsheviks were trying to protect innocent people, let's say Romanov's family and some other people. Now, another again negative effect, he created the murder machine that became the foundation for Stalin's purges, in which over 20 million of people died. And therefore, kind of as a conclusion, you can ask again, who was Lenin? In my view, he was probably the most influential man of the last 2 or more centuries, who produced the greatest impact on how the modern world functioned. But he's certainly not a great man. So that probably would be something which, how can I describe here? Now, going back to the Western world, because in the West we have many stereotypes, and again, since I live like in the Western world since 1994, I can certainly see and hear these stereotypes very often related to Russia and communism. And these stereotypes commonly relate to presentation of Russia like it's like a tyrann country, the Putin is tyrann, and the dictatorship, like and so the kind of dictatorial rule of communism. Therefore, like you can see here that this is a kind of a stereotype, a pattern, which is used by public media, particularly again newspapers, TV, and so on, and often high-ranking politicians, sometimes presidents, prime ministers, they use similar language, and that is kind of the situation where we can think about kind of, okay, if we present a country in this way, would it be something which is useful, which is constructive in order to have dialogue with this country, in order to help this country to change? And maybe we can draw here an analogy with a person. Imagine like there is like a criminal, or a person who had criminal past, and so how other people would react to this criminal. So this criminal could be like, okay, other people could react in a different way. Somebody might say, oh, that's a criminal. No? Let us forget all the rest. about this person, so it's only a criminal. But okay, this continues, and another neighbor, a relative, maybe, like let's say somebody from the same household, like some other roommates or whatever, like neighbors, all people would start using this type of language and this type of attitude. Would it be a productive activity in order for this criminal to change? And if these activities take place in the real world, because there are all type of accusations which could be done, for example, against Vladimir Putin and modern Russia. Well, at least if they exist, they certainly exist not to the same degree, and there would be certainly maybe separate cases which hard to tell for me exactly, for example, personally, because I'm not aware. I'm going to talk more about Vladimir Putin and what I discovered about him in the next part. So about Putin and about also one KGB Leninist I want to mention.